a real treat, Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan comes in and sits down and proceeds to give us a contemporary history of drug policy from his perspective, as since the 1970s, he's been on top of it. Ethan Nadelmann, enjoy. Okay, yeah. So this is the Ethan Nadelmann.
Good to be here, Seth.
I mean, in the flesh, this is fantastic. This is the good thing about me being in New York and I guess you being in New York.
Exactly. You're 8 blocks south of me, between 6th and 7th Avenue. What could be easier?
And so for those that understand these types of things, they can already hear you are from New York, sir.
I am from New York, born, not bred, born in New York City, grew up in the suburbs in Westchester, and moved back to the city in the end of 92, so over 2 decades ago.
I mean, that's close enough. We include, the northern suburbs as well as the easterly suburbs, if you will.
Exactly. Although when you say the city, you got to be true to quote the city.
Oh, sure. No, I said you were from New York, but yes.
That's right.
You were born and bred, or born at least in the city. Now you're a city resident once again. Upper West, I think we discussed, right? It's beautiful up there.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I love living in New York City. I mean, some people say they want to live elsewhere. New York's a nice place to visit. For me, this is where I want to live, and every place else is a beautiful place to visit. And of course, when you live in the city, it's important to get out because it's so dynamic, so much energy, so intense that you need to get out and breathe and see the stars and breathe the air. But, I get bored after a little while. I got to come back here.
That's it. Get out of the city, of course. And then you get a little homesick and you get out of the tunnel or whatever it is coming in from the airport and you're like,
well,
back.
I mean, Seth, when you live in the center of the universe and you enjoy living in the center of the universe, then you want to spend at least half your time here.
I am right there
with you. And it's where
I
plan to retire. What better place to retire?
Well, before you retire, let's get into what you're doing. Of course, you run DPA, but what is it that you see as your job? What when you get into work these days and it's July of 2015, what is your job as you see it?
Well, I mean, remember, Drug Policy Alliance, we're the leading, not just marijuana reform, but drug policy reform writ large. And so even though the work we do on marijuana gets the lion's share of the media attention, it's probably a third of our overall work, right? Because the other 2/3, another third or so is about reducing mass incarceration, ending mass incarceration. And that's everything from the crack powder laws to the mandatory minimum laws to the notorious, Rockefeller drug laws in New York some years ago, to taking on the private bail bond industry, all that stuff, which involves not just marijuana, but even more so other drugs, where we're not necessarily trying to legalize everything the same way we are with marijuana, but where we are trying to roll back incarceration in this country. And the last third is really about treating drug use and addiction as health issues. It's why we led the effort in the 90s to legalize needle exchange programs to reduce HIV/AIDS. It's why we've led the effort nationally for the last 10, 15 years to reduce overdose fatalities involving heroin and other opioids. So those three areas, marijuana reform, sentencing reform, and harm reduction public health approach to drug use and addiction, those are our three major thrusts. And then we take on issues on the side, like reforming the asset forfeiture laws, which is becoming a growing priority once again for us.
Interesting. And, with those three priorities.
Well, you were saying, what I worry about on the marijuana thing, it's really, it's keeping the ball moving down the field. I mean, at this point, we have a slim majority of the American public in favor of taxing and regulating marijuana, more or less like alcohol. We have 4 states down and sort of D.C., but 46 to go. We have one country down, Uruguay, and sort of Jamaica, but almost 200 to go, right? Because we focus, although the U.S. is the major focus of our work, we're also looking internationally. And there's all sorts of things that could trip this up. So part of my job is keeping the ball moving down the field, keeping the movement from avoiding mistakes. When the industry or some players in it get over greedy, when activists get overconfident, when funders say, hey, it's already in the bag, it's part of my job to say, guys, remember, marijuana ain't going to legalize itself. This is not a done deed in the way, for example, marriage equality is probably a done deed now, right?
Well, now we've got a Supreme Court ruling, so.
Well, and in fact, if you look at the difference between the two, if you line up the Gallup polls on support for legalizing marijuana and support for gay marriage, they basically are almost identical from 2004 to 2014, from more or less 34% back in 2004 in favor to 54% as of last year. So on the public opinion side, they've been basically, I mean, the graphs barely diverge at all. But on the other hand, gay marriage, marriage equality, now has had for many years, it's had a growing number of states. It's had governors in favor, senators in favor, the White House in favor. Marijuana legalization, barely a senator, barely a governor, and the White House, I'd say a little better than expected, but not clearly for legalization, right? With marriage equality, you have 18 or so foreign countries that have legalized gay marriage. With marijuana, one foreign country, Uruguay. The gay marriage has won it now in the Supreme Court. With marijuana legalization, we're almost no place in the courts. And then you look at the challenges, right? When Democratic and sometimes Republican politicians are out there, they're meeting wealthy gay people or families of gay people who are very clear and uninhibited about saying this is a key issue for them. When the same politicians are out there, how many donors are out there saying marijuana legalization is an issue and in their face? I mean, maybe a dozen, and I probably know at least half of them, if not all of them.
Exactly, but most of them are industry, if nothing
exactly.
else.
Well, there's a few even but pre-industry, but not a lot. And then finally, when you look at the challenges of implementation, the thing that distinguishes marijuana legalization and makes it so much more difficult than marriage equality is the interstate issues and the fact that it involves a commodity. Right? With marriage equality, differences in state laws or conflicts between federal and state law create challenges and issues, which that movement is dealing with. For marijuana legalization, it's not just the differences. It's the fact that there's a commodity involved that implicates interstate commerce, where people doing something totally legally in one state can actually go to prison for 10 years in another state for engaging in the same activity. And that interstate commodity element to this thing presents a whole nother level of challenges. So in some respects, the marijuana legalization part of me, of my life and the agenda, looks at the gay rights and gay marriage thing as kind of our elder sibling and a role model. But at the same time, I'm very aware of the much more substantial challenges that we confront, even though we probably have a similar percent of public support on our side.
So even though we're right there with you, or right there with them, we're way far behind.
Well, we are. I mean, look, so far, yes. I mean, we are way behind, and it's also why I don't think it's automatic. I don't see the Supreme Court giving marijuana legalization a clear victory for a very long time to come.
Certainly not tomorrow.
No, I don't see that many governors and senators stepping up uninhibitedly in the way they did for gay marriage. I don't see that many foreign governments stepping out the way that they did. I think we are significantly behind, and it's why, I'm old enough also to remember the late 1970s when I was in college and I was not yet an activist, but I remember, how most of us thought that marijuana legalization was maybe around the corner back then, and then saw what happened in the 1980s when public support, including among young people, dropped dramatically. So I'm aware of the fact that we could get derailed, not just by missteps on the part of the industry or the movement or the activists or the donors, but also by something terrible happening in our society.
You've seen public opinion change.
I've seen it change dramatically. I remember 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden drug policy reform had a little traction in the late 90s, and all of a sudden, we were calling ourselves the new anti-war movement, and also we had to throw out those bumper stickers because there were other real wars going on, right? So I'm aware that public opinion can be fickle, that the demographic trends are very much on our side, but I've seen how demographic trends in the late 70s, early 80s did not clinch it for marijuana decrim back in those years.
All right, so that's where we are. That's where we have been. Let's talk about you a little bit, get to understand who you are, because who you are informs what you do. You mentioned going to school in the late 70s. We've already talked about the fact that you grew up just outside of the city. What was it like? I think I know that, and I think we can tell you speak so well. You must be the son of an orator, right? Your dad was
My dad was a rabbi, ordained as a conservative rabbi, and then he became the leader of the Jewish Reconstructionist movement, which is sort of the fourth wing of American Judaism. And so, I was very much shaped by him. I can barely remember a single word he ever said, but I know that his ways of thinking and also his ways of speaking infused who I am today.
And I don't mean to get too far in, but it does kind of help inform, once again, it helped inform the conversation. Conservative Judaism is very different than Reconstructionism.
Well, not that much in a sense. I mean, some of your listeners may know there's three main branches of American Judaism. Orthodox, which are the very traditional, and which has many different groups within it. The Reform, which are the most liberal, started by the sort of German Jewish immigrants in the mid-19th century, and Conservative, which is sort of in the middle, somewhat traditional, but trying to figure out how to have a semi-traditional Jewish life in American society. And Reconstructionist Judaism emerged in the 1930s, founded by a guy who was my father's mentor, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, basically that looked at Judaism not as a religion, but as an evolving civilization or people, and which embraced the notion that Judaism had to keep evolving in order to stay fresh for new generations. And that North America was a special place in Jewish history, and that while making Aliyah, moving to Israel, was a mitzvah, a good deed, or a commandment, that there was something special about building a vibrant Jewish community in America. And it also was the first one in which women were treated fully as equal. The first bat mitzvah, the first female rabbis, all of that was the Reconstructionist movement. And in many ways, Reform and conservative Judaism have embraced and adapted many of the ideas that began with Reconstructionist Judaism. The analogy for me in my life is with drug policy reform, that same way in which our movement is infusing movements around personal freedom, around racial justice, around social justice, around a lot of things. And also that kind of bigger question, just as Reconstructionist Judaism had to struggle, are we a fourth movement in American Judaism, or are we more an intellectual movement that will infuse the others? Similarly, the drug policy reform movement has struggled with the notion, are we a distinct political movement in American and global society, or are we more of an intellectual movement meant to infuse these other areas, reproductive rights, racial justice, social justice, civil liberties, what have you? And that's an ongoing internal sort of discussion.
Is your take on each both?
Yeah, I think so. But of course, it's the struggle. It's here I've spent my life, really building up the leading drug policy reform organization in the world, Drug Policy Alliance, but where building the drug policy reform movement is really my broader passion, right? When the time comes for me to retire or whatever, I hope that Drug Policy Alliance DPA is a vibrant and growing organization that I can hand off the leadership to somebody. But ultimately, it's what happens with drug policy writ large in American and global society. That's what's most important to me.
Indeed. And we've spoken with Amanda Ryman, as you know, and so you've got a pretty good one there.
The thing about DPA is the people who work at DPA, the people who have worked at DPA, it's just an extraordinary group of people. I mean, the people running our offices around the country in New York and New Jersey, New Mexico, California, and Colorado, and DC, the people working in our legal affairs office and our media offices, and obviously our development office, we have incredible talent. And we now have, because hundreds of people have now worked at DPA, we have an alumni network, some of whom come back and work for us as lobbyists or other consultants or what have you. So I really feel like we're infusing a movement here.
Indeed. You absolutely are. You speak of a movement, and you talked about how that kind of goes hand in hand with, way that your father was dealing with religion, and how those two kind of philosophies overlap. What about your mother? What
Well,
came from
my
her?
mom was remarkable, is remarkable. I mean, she lives across the park, Central Park from me in New York City now. But my mom was remarkable because she went, she was very much of a feminist, going back to the 60s and 70s.
A true feminist.
Yeah, a true feminist, one of 5 women to start NYU law school back in the 50s, dropped out to get married. But then when she was in her 30s, went back to Columbia, got a master's degree in biostatistics. Then she went to Yale to pursue further graduate work and landed up getting a master's in philosophy at Yale and became a biostatistician, basically doing statistical work, working for pharmaceutical companies. And so the part of my mind that's more mathematical and research oriented and such really comes from my mom.
Yeah.
And I'm very lucky to have that fusion of my dad being a rabbi and a brilliant speaker and a broad-minded intellectual, and my mom having come at this from a more scientific and mathematical perspective. And so really getting that fusion from the two of them.
And there's some construction going on upstairs. I don't know if you can hear that, but that is pretty unbelievably great stock that you come from.
Well, I'll tell you that the other thing, of course, was growing up, my dad, having been born in Berlin in 1928 and emigrate, and then fleeing to Ecuador in 1939 and coming to the U.S. in 1946 when he was 18 on a scholarship. His father, having fought and won the Iron Cross for Germany in the First World War and then being murdered in Auschwitz in the Second World War. So that consciousness around Jewish history and the demonization of a people, the stigmatization, demonization, the racist genocide that characterized that period, that plays a monumental role in terms of my passion for social justice. And my perception that, although I would never equate one genocide with another or compare the war on drugs to that racist genocide back then, but that demonization and persecution of a minority that happened to my people, especially during the Holocaust, but even throughout Jewish history, it created a sense of empathy and identity and understanding with other groups that have been persecuted throughout history. Mm-hmm. And I really see the persecution, what happened with respect to drug users, drug dealers, the whole drug thing, beginning with Nixon's war on drug in the 70s and then picking up, horrific steam with his bipartisan war on drugs in the late 80s and 90s. I really see that analogy to the persecution, not just of Jews, but other minorities throughout history.
Yeah, and let's pick that up with how it kind of overlaps with your history. You speak of Nixon in the 70s. That's when you had already gotten to Harvard. Is that right?
Well, I graduated college in 75. Yeah, I actually probably tried marijuana a couple times with friends in the high school band, but I first went to college at McGill University in Montreal, which is where I first started getting high, and where most of what we, in fact, smoked was hash, because that's what was common in Montreal at that time, and that's what part of this whole thing about, higher THC cannabis being so different from lower THC. I mean, I was smoking hash in 1975, which was higher potency than marijuana, and I didn't remember that much of a difference. So, but that's where it first kind of hit me that there was something fundamentally wrong with these drug laws. That here was alcohol, which I enjoyed, but which is obviously so much more dangerous, and yet people were getting popped for marijuana. And
in Canada as well?
Up in Canada,
Yeah.
friends who were crossing the border back to the U.S.
Right.
And I remember I was studying political science and taking a theory course and reading John Stuart Mill's classic On Liberty, about the distinction between self-regarding and other regarding acts, and the proper role of the state was to, protect people from other people who were being harmful, hurting their fellow human beings. But when it came to regard activity that was fundamentally self-regarding, that was none of the state's business. And that just kind of, that idea kind of resonated with me and probably helped shape what I ended up doing, a decade or more later.
Absolutely. And so that's McGill. And then,
then I was having a great time in Montreal, and I figured that, that I wanted to, that I would see if I could get into one of the top schools. So I applied to transfer to Harvard, I think Harvard and Yale and Oxford or something. And by some quirk, I landed up getting into Harvard. It was almost impossible to do so. But they accepted a few extra people that year as transfer students, and so I got into Harvard.
Well, we've spoken about these very smart people that who are your parents and who were your parents, and you seem like a pretty smart guy yourself. Why would you call it a quirk for you getting into Harvard?
Well, I mean, part of it was, I was not a very diligent student in high school, which is why I didn't get into the top Ivy Leagues back then. And then Harvard, I mean, the acceptance rate was, normally 2%, or I think the year I applied it was 6%.
Right.
So the odds were very much against it. But I lucked out. And I got in, and I transferred there as a junior, did well there, spent a year at London School of Economics getting a master's degree, and then came back to Harvard and did a law degree and a PhD in political science. So I ended up getting 3 or technically 4 degrees, a BA, an MA, a JD, and a PhD at Harvard.
Right. So that explains the 10 years that we see on your...
77 to 87. I liked school, and I must admit I didn't take it very seriously, but I did well enough. And then I got lucky once again by getting the job at Princeton in 87.
Well, before we talk about that, let's make sure we understand. You didn't take school too seriously as a high school student, but then what was it that turned you on to realizing that you wanted to be at the best or with the best and the brightest?
Well, I mean, I always sort of knew if I could get into the top place, hell, I'd go.
Right.
I mean, why not? And getting in and then doing well there. I was always, I was not the most diligent student even there, but I was very good at 2 things. I was good at cramming for exams, and I was especially good at writing papers. And those 2 things kind of meant that, I never worked as hard as most of the other kids who were doing really well, except for the geniuses, and I was no genius. But I did well enough to do, law school. I think I barely attended any classes for a year there. I just wasn't very diligent about it. But I kept having a few lucky breaks along the way.
And so, yet you're acknowledging, doesn't go to class too often at Harvard Law, yet still gets by.
Well, once you get into Harvard Law, you don't have to work very hard to, to graduate. I mean, fortunately. And the PhD thing, once again, part of it was, my fascination had really been with Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy in undergrad and my first years of graduate school. The first articles I ever published, either in the newspapers or academic journals, were on Middle East politics. But I really kind of burnt out on that after my second or third year of graduate school. It was getting very depressing, and there was more and more extremism appearing both on the Jewish side and the Arab side, and I just felt...
And this was the mid-'80s.
This was early. This was 82, really.
Okay.
And I kind of was... And then I remember just a friend of mine saying, Ethan, you've always been fascinated by this drugs and crime stuff. And everybody knew in graduate school that one of my objectives at Harvard graduate school was to try to get as many of my friends high as possible. Not that I could ever admit that now, but I mean,
you just did.
I just did, yeah. So, and I did not. I should just go on record as saying I did not succeed with many of them because many of them are in very prominent places in American society now. But so a friend just said, Ethan, why not do this drugs and crime thing? And I said, yeah, why not? I wasn't taking myself all that seriously. It was very off the beaten track. Nobody else was working on that issue more or less back then. And I found a few advisors, one in the graduate program in political science that I was in the government department, one in the law school, one in the Kennedy School, which I was not in, but there was a guy working on that stuff. And I put together something and wrote a dissertation and eventually a book on, not actually on drug policy, it was on the internationalization of criminal law enforcement. I actually, Seth, talked my way into the State Department. I got myself a security clearance. I spent a year, 84, 85, working for the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics Matters. I wrote a classified report on global drug money laundering. I got funding, and I went all around Latin America, Europe, and interviewed DEA guys in 19 different countries and foreign drug enforcement. I was basically undercovering the undercover guys. And I got to the point where I actually knew more about how DEA operated internationally than most of the DEA guys, than almost anybody in the DEA did. And so I wrote a dissertation about that and then a book called Cops Across Borders, which actually the guys in the DEA really liked and respected because I leaned over backwards not to put my drug policy views in there. And my drug policy views, I've had since I was in college, more or less. So it was kind of almost living there and then at Princeton, this dual life of being an academic expert on the internationalization of crime and law enforcement, and on the other hand, being this advocate for ending the drug war.
So we'll get to being an advocate for ending the drug war, because that persists, if you will. This sounds like a movie. You talked your way into the State Department, and you were undercover the undercover.
Yeah.
How did you do this?
It was, I had the Harvard, kind of degree behind me. I go to interview a few people in the Justice Department, the State Department. We hit it off. Guy in the State Department, I remember him, John Wyant in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He had been the chief liaison between the intelligence community and the State Department. He'd done a PhD. He took a liking to me. He said, the only way you can really learn this is to come work on the inside. I then, persuaded the guy who was heading the Narcotics Bureau, John Thomas, who used to work for the CIA, that he should give me a consulting contract to write about drug-related money laundering.
Sure.
And then I would hang out at the State Department every day, and when everybody went home, I would go through the files and go through the, I had access to secret and top secret. I didn't see the super stuff. But, one thing that struck me was how little in the stuff that was marked secret and top secret was not already publicly known in the newspapers.
Right.
I mean, there was a little internal stuff. And I remember it was the time when that DEA guy in Mexico, Camarena, was kidnapped and tortured and murdered by the Mexican narcos. And the whole place went berserk, State Department, DEA. So I was in the inside watching the internal communications about that stuff. And, I was also enough on the inside to realize that nobody working in those agencies, State Department of Justice or the others, knew anything about drugs.
Well, this is during the Just Say No, Reagan's 80s.
It was,
right?
This was 84, 85, right? Nancy Reagan was going that way.
Yeah.
And I eventually would meet some people and we would confide in one another that this whole thing was ridiculous.
Right.
But part of my job was to find out how these guys did what they did and to be truthful and right about this remarkable thing, which was the DEA was truly the first global police agency in history. And the U.S. Justice Department was becoming an international Justice Department. And to write about it in a very academic, non-conspiratorial way.
So you've spoken about this. You literally wrote the book on it. In retrospect now, looking back on it, how could things have changed to make it be a different reality? You saw its pervasiveness. What could have been done in real time, if anything? And I'll follow that question with understanding, whatever your answer is, what can be done now?
Well, it's a great question. Nobody's ever actually asked me that question about the 80s. And I don't have a great answer, although in thinking about it retrospectively, I think the only thing that would have kept the drug war from going, obviously, I think if there had been a Democrat in the White House instead of a Republican, Reagan, and Bush, I think that would have made some difference. I think the way in which key people, Nixon, Reagan, Bush, William Bennett, the way in which they understood the political advantage that could be taken of the drug issue to advance a reactionary Republican agenda in American society, not the broad-based Republican agenda, but truly the reactionary, not the libertarian, the more William Bennett, socially conservative, the ways in which you could play on people's fears around their kids, the ways in which you could, where in a society in which overt racism had been delegitimized, the ways in which pursuing a drug war would be a way to pursue a somewhat racist agenda without calling it that, and one where you could actually get the support of African American leadership for a policy and a campaign that was actually devastating those communities. So a Democrat in the White House might have made some difference, but I say that with the caveat that it was very much a bipartisan drug war. And the Tip O'Neills and other congressional leaders and the Democratic governors were almost as much on board as were the Republicans. I think the only thing that might have derailed it, and this is a terrible thing to say, is if we'd had a real war going on in the 80s. The Vietnam War had wound down and ended in 75, in some respects a little earlier. We got into, in the 80s, we didn't have a war going on. And that sentiment and how you whip up the American public behind something, and the drug thing played beautifully to that. And it's interesting to note that it was when we had the first Gulf War, right after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and then the U.S. intervention, that I remember the whole drug war craziness going on beginning in 86, mounting up into 90, and then all of a sudden falling off dramatically. Like my phone went from ringing nonstop to barely ringing around the Gulf War. It was like it had, the drug war at that point had been institutionalized with all the new laws at the federal and state level, and the UN Convention of 88. But in terms of the public opinion, the public passions around it, that just dropped off as soon as there was a real war going on.
There you go. So you always got to have two wars: war on drugs and the Cold War were the '80s wars, and then
well, remember the Cold War had was kind of winding down also, because remember you have the Soviet Union, Gorbachev comes in. You have the Cold War. Afghanistan was the Russian invasion already happened, years before. So in fact, the Cold War had lost its singular passion and focus by that time as well.
But the wall doesn't fall until the 90s.
Well, things begin to crumble in what, 89, 90, 91? I mean, you have that remarkable period, right? I mean, it's the period where the first President Bush and his Secretary James Baker, I think deserve a lot of credit for managing the fall of communism. If somebody had said to a typical American in 1985 or 86, could you imagine the Soviet Union crumbling into a dozen different states?
No way.
And without there being large-scale violence involved?
Way. Yeah.
So that had to be managed properly. And it's someplace where I give, even though I've been much more drawn to Democrats and Republicans much of my life, it's where I do give the Republicans some credit for managing that.
Indeed. All right. So that covers, where you were in the State Department, undercover. And, so finally you kind of come out and that's where Princeton type of your job.
Well, I luck out. I get this job. In fact, that was an interesting story too, because one of the guys I'd started graduate school with, who became one of my closest friends, was a fellow named John DiIulio. And John DiIulio was a disciple of James Q. Wilson, the leading sort of conservative criminal justice academic in the country. He was more than that, and John eventually became the first faith-based czar for President Bush. He co-authored a book with William Bennett and John Walters, who subsequently became drug czar. So here, one of my closest friends was a guy who was so much on the other side politically, but John went to Princeton in 86, and he helped me get the job there in 87. And so notwithstanding that we were politically at odds on this bigger issue of criminal justice and drug policy, we had a kind of brotherly relationship.
How so?
We just kind of loved one another, and we're still just, just dear friends on some fundamental heart-based level. It's where, your sibling can go and become a radically other thing, but, somehow we kept that going. And we never let our political disagreement get in the way of our friendship. And I'm proud to say and happy to say that John DiIulio has now come very close to embracing the drug policy reform agenda and repudiating much of what he was just associated with back in those years.
Yeah.
But I went to Princeton, and I was teaching there in 87, and they asked me to teach a drug policy seminar, which I was happy to do. That became a way for me to meet some of the early leaders, the Andrew Wiles, and just a whole range of people working in the area. And then I wrote a piece in an academic article in Foreign Policy magazine in spring of 1988, basically saying that the drug war is responsible for most of what we typically identify as part and parcel of the drug problem. And that article appeared in the spring of 88. A few weeks later, The Economist magazine came out and said more or less the same thing for the first time. A few weeks later, a new mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, African-American, former Rhodes Scholar, former chief prosecutor, came out and said the same thing at the Conference of Mayors. All of these things happening independently of one another. Schmoke had not read my piece of The Economist, but it meant that here the drug war was really hitting fever pitch by 1988. And here was this young Princeton professor, this young Baltimore mayor, The Economist, and oh, by the way, William Buckley and Milton Friedman on the right, and by the way, the ACLU on the left. And we were basically saying the same thing. And the media, also I had my first 15 minutes of fame. It was like the whole drug war was going crazy. New York Times had a special editor. It was the cover of news magazines, television shows. You couldn't look at a newsstand or turn on the TV without seeing this stuff there. And basically we were played for, like, we were the comedy element. Like, oh, and now let's hear for 15 minutes from the guys who want to legalize all drugs. Even though Schmoke and I and others were actually not committed to full legalization, we were just saying, let's look at the way in which prohibition is a major part of the problem. And so, I'm 31-year-old, academic, first year Princeton professor. And all of a sudden, I'm on Larry King debating Al D'Amato, and on Nightline with Charlie Rangel and Kurt Schmoke, and a front page of the New York Times and Newsweek and Time Magazine and all of this stuff. And so that was a very exciting kind of popping out into global media attention. And then a year later, I was involved in a federal judge, Robert Sweet, coming out for legalization. I played a role in his coming out, showing up on the front page of the New York Times.
There you go.
And so it was 89. At this point I was 32, second year at Princeton, third year. And article appears on the front page of the New York Times, about this judge's speech and talking about William Buckley and Milton Friedman, the famous conservatives, and Kurt Schmoke and a few others. And behind it all, they said, was this young assistant professor at Princeton, Ethan Nadelmann. So all of a sudden I had another 15 minutes of fame, and I was publishing this stuff in a very prestigious journal, Science Magazine. And so it just, it was a moment and all of a sudden I was getting invited all around the country and the world to speak about ending the drug war. Being identified as a legalizer, and I say, guys, I'm not there for selling cocaine and heroin over the counter. I think we should think about that as a possibility and why we're afraid of it. But I'm not saying that's the answer. But it got me out there, and at the same time, NORML had fallen on very hard times in the 80s and almost gone under. But a new organization called the Drug Policy Foundation had emerged in the late 80s, founded by two guys, Arnold Treback and Kevin Zeese. And I got involved with them and, on their board and organizing their conferences. And, and so those were the years of really being out there as a kind of provocateur for a new way of thinking about drug policy.
I want to kind of get your thoughts on that in retrospect, because at the time, I'm sure it was hard to actually kind of conceive. But before that, did you meet Buckley? Did you meet Friedman or no?
Oh yeah.
Oh, you did.
Oh sure.
Oh, we got to go.
In fact, I can't remember if we put it up on YouTube or not. But there's a wonderful panel of George Schultz and Milton Friedman and I and me at the Hoover Institution conference, where one of our allies, Joe McNamara, a former police chief, we helped him organize these conferences on drug policy for law enforcement leaders. And so Milton Friedman, I got to know a bit. I remember arguing with him about drug policy. I remember at that thing when speaking and him nudging me that I wasn't radical enough from his perspective. But he became a donor to the Drug Policy Alliance.
He did?
Yeah. And I think he was one of the first awardees of the Drug Policy Foundation. Buckley and I got to know one another. I remember having lunch with him in the city and being on his TV show a few times and being down in Louisville, Kentucky on something with him. And I remember whenever I wanted him to write a column, I'd call him up and say, Bill, can you do this? And the next day there'd be a column on this issue. So Buckley became a key ally. I started doing some writing for National Review, his magazine.
Sure.
So no, those guys were great. I tried to orchestrate The Nation, the left-wing magazine,
Sure.
and National Review doing a joint project, but I think Katrina vanden Heuvel of The Nation was sort of willing. Buckley wasn't willing. So those guys were really just major allies.
Yeah.
And both of them, and especially Friedman, writing not just from a kind of hard libertarian perspective, but from even a civil libertarian moral perspective. It was part of what I really respected about them.
What do you think Milton Friedman meant by "you're not radical enough"?
Well, because I hedged on full-scale legalization, right? I mean, my view was drug prohibition is causing most of the harms. We should clearly legalize marijuana, but do we want to be selling crack cocaine over the counter? And his view as a libertarian was, of course,
right.
And the market will take care of itself.
Sure.
Or I would suggest that the FDA would have a constructive role to play, and he'd say, why do you need the FDA?
Exactly.
Why not a private organization
Right.
like Consumer Reports? To which I didn't have a great answer to that one. So it was partially that my lacking the full-scale confidence of the market, or because I'm really a civil libertarian, or as some of us call ourselves, a social justice libertarian. In the sense that I care a lot more about issues of fairness and equality than most libertarians do. but I care more passionately about liberty and freedom than most liberals do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I and a close network of friends and intellectuals have referred to ourselves as the social justice libertarians for the last 20 years.
I love it. It's perfect.
It's perfect, except it doesn't ring very well.
Yeah, it needs better marketing.
Exactly.
As do the Jews, by the way.
Yes, that's also true.
Yeah.
Especially these days. Yeah.
Anyway, just one last question on Buckley, because we spoke a little bit about Milton Friedman, the person. Buckley, the person, give us a little bit more behind the scenes there. What kind of, truly what kind of person was that?
Well, Buckley, he was such a grand figure, right? The leading conservative intellectual who had crossed over to influencing public opinion of the second half of the 20th century. Very charming. He also had a nice personal relationship with Ira Glasser, who was the longtime head of the ACLU from the late 70s through 2001. So he had a willingness and an ability to engage across with liberals, with others, where he could agree on various issues and disagree respectfully. He suspected that my instincts were more, on the more liberal side. And then once I, jumping forward, connected with Soros, I was more obviously on that side. But, he was, and there were some things, where he would say something like, I think we should have the death penalty for providing drugs to kids. And I kind of look at him like, I wish he would stop that stuff. That was just over the top. But I so much admired his commitment and passion on this issue. There was a guy, was it Pete McWilliams or something, who was also a gay man, libertarian, wrote a book called Ain't Nobody's Business, or Ain't Misbehaving, something like Ain't Nobody's Business. And he had a real passionate connection with this guy too. And so it just meant so much to him. I also had the privilege, as I recall, of introducing Milton Friedman and Thomas Sass. Thomas Sass was a libertarian anti-psychiatry psychiatrist, had authored The Myth of Mental Illness, but also a classic book in drug policy called Ceremonial Chemistry, in which he talked about the ritual persecution of Jews and minorities and witches and drug users and pushers.
Right.
And so, there was some really grand old figures, and I disagreed with each of them on numerous things. But their passion at calling out what was evil and wrong about drug prohibition was the thing that we bonded on.
Yeah, and I think that does point out how maybe things were different then, when you could actually have a dialogue with people that you completely disagreed with.
Yeah, well, it still exists in our field because, interestingly, just to jump forward here, Seth, Grover Norquist is one of my key allies.
Indeed.
Right? And he arranged for me to speak at the what's it called? The leading right-wing gathering.
CPAC?
CPAC. Yeah. He arranged for me to speak or debate twice already 5-10 years or so ago. And there are other leading right-wingers and conservatives, sometimes, very provocative right-wing talk show hosts and others who agree on this sort of stuff.
Well, in the industry, you don't have just a bunch of left-wing hippies running the business side of this industry. It is very much center, if not center right, as far as the business
and
leaders.
I should also say, when you debate people on the other side, so there are people who I've debated, and I have, a real almost not only dislike, but almost a contempt for some of the policy views they take. But, you learn how to be civil, or you are civil. Yeah. And maintaining civil relationships with most of our opponents. There may be one or two that sort of nutcases.
Sure.
And typically the ones who are not intellectual, who are just kind of fanatics, where you basically can, you keep it together for a TV show, but you don't want to spend any time. But there are others who are more intellectual, more thoughtful, who have a emotional or moralistic or just a different reading of the evidence, where it can be, you can sit down and have a meal or a coffee afterward, even as you're debating in a very feisty way right before or after.
Even still, so that's good.
Yeah.
So let's go through the 90s. You mentioned how the Gulf War certainly affected public opinion. Give us the 90s in 30 seconds, I guess.
Sure. Well, the key thing I did, apart from being out speaking and writing around the country and trying to influence media and that stuff, I created something called the Princeton Working Group on the future of drug use and alternatives to drug prohibition. And that was pulling together 18 academics from a dozen disciplines to try to think through what would be the optimal drug policy, the one that would most effectively reduce both the harms of drugs and the harms of prohibitionist policies. And that intellectual exercise about imagining, not just for cannabis, but for all drugs, what would be optimal drug policies, became sort of the intellectual origins of the institute I created when I left Princeton. The other thing that was significant was in 1992, I'd been thinking about creating my own thing, like a think tank or something, and I get a call out of the blue from a guy named George Soros, who I didn't, he wasn't famous as yet, but I'd seen his name. And
because he was already rich.
He was already rich. He'd written a book. I remember seeing Remaindered in some bookstore. And I looked him up, and he was a hedge fund guy and had done some, philanthropy in Eastern Europe and such. And he invited me to lunch, and he was concerned about the drug war. He'd been funding the opposition to Soviet dictatorship and Soviet communism in Eastern Europe or whatever. And communism had fallen much faster than he expected in the early 90s. And he had always assumed that America would be the role model for what he called the open society, or his philosophical, mentor, Karl Popper, called the open society. But when he looked at what was antithetical to open society principles, the first thing that hit him between the eyes was the drug war. And then there was the fortunate coincidence that first article I mentioned to you in Foreign Policy magazine in '88, right before or after that one was a piece on Black Monday, the stock market crash of 1987 by a guy named George Soros.
Oh, boy.
So I think there was a karmic coincidence of his having read my piece back in '88, and then flash forward to '92, and he's looking for who to talk to on this issue. And I was probably the most prominent academic on that issue at the time, and there'd been this piece. So we hit it off.
Yeah.
And at the end of our lunch, we argued, we debated. And he goes at the end of lunch, he goes, look, I see we basically agree on the core issues. We'll have our disagreements. So I'm a very busy man, but I have substantial resources. So let's assume I want to empower you to accomplish our common objectives. I laughed. I went back home to Princeton. I wrote him a proposal. I said, help me start a think tank, start funding a grants program that I can oversee, right? And support the Drug Policy Foundation, which I've been involved with. And a year later, we shook hands, made a deal. A year after that, in '94, I left Princeton. I started up my project. It was then called the Lindesmith Center, named after Alfred Lindesmith, who was the first prominent academic to challenge conventional thinking on drug policy. And I essentially became the eldest child of the emerging Soros U.S. Foundation.
Okay.
And that was the origins of what became the Drug Policy Alliance 6 years later.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Just quickly, you spoke of an institute that you started at Princeton right before you left.
Well, I did. I created this Princeton working group, but months before I got that call from Soros, I'd been sort of talking with a colleague or two about creating a think tank or an interdisciplinary center for the study of drugs and drug policy. And when I met Soros, it's kind of like if you build it, they will come, or if you think it, if you begin to imagine what you could do, then somehow maybe the universe will deliver on something.
Sure.
And that, of course, is what happened. And initially, I thought I was going to create an interdisciplinary think tank in an academic institution. And then Soros said, look, I'm creating my own U.S. Open Society Institute. Why don't you become the first project of that? And that's how I landed up doing that. And initially, I thought it would be an academic think tank. But within a year, I realized that we had to become an advocacy institute.
It's amazing. And just one more point on what you shared about ultimate drug policy. What were the key takeaways from that study that you did at that time?
Well, what I pulled together, it was 18 academics from a dozen disciplines. All were highly critical of the drug war, but none of them were libertarians. So it became the challenge of what would be the best way to minimize the harms of prohibition without inviting big increases in drug abuse. Or alternatively, taking the alcohol and tobacco model, how much could you increase regulatory controls, time and place constraints, all that sort of stuff, while at the same time minimizing the black market? And it was that balance. And the model that we came up with was something I then called the right of access or mail order model. It was imagining a model whereby, it's funny because you jump forward to Silk Road these days and the question of people obtaining drugs over the internet and the ways, if you think about it, one of the interesting things about Silk Road is that on some respects, it may turn out to be down the road the least bad way to deal with drug control in our society.
How do you mean? That's a big statement.
Well, because if you think about it, what it does, for example, by allowing drug purchasing over the internet, first of all, the nature of these things is that you have instant consumer feedback, right? So people know what they're getting. The drugs are connected with information and feedback about sellers and uses. There's this wonderful website, Erowid, which has information about drugs, right? So there's a way of informing the consumers and providing feedback about the sellers. The other thing is, it's all happening on the internet, which means drug markets, violent drug markets, organized crime, violence, crime, corruption, that basically stops happening, right? It also means that you can ensure some levels of quality control because consumers are constantly reporting back to this thing, right? So it turns out to be a way. It also means that you can have this without allowing over-the-counter advertising and billboards the way we have with alcohol and tobacco. It means that different states
and pharmaceuticals,
it means different states and localities can basically say no public sale of these drugs, no advertising, no nothing. But no matter where you live, you can order this through the mail, through the internet, right? And the problems are, how do you prevent access for young people, kids? I mean, that's one of the issues. How do there are issues, but I think if we fast forward the next 5, 10, or 20 years, you see the growing role that synthetic drugs are playing in terms of psychoactive drug consumption. I think that there are elements to the whole Silk Road thing that may turn out to play a major role in a future drug control policy where we've dramatically reduced the harms associated with the drug war and drug prohibition today.
That's fascinating. So you mentioned the kernels of DPA. If you could, as a last question, give us the tentpoles that brought it from those first days to these current days before I ask you 3 final questions.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, when it comes to the marijuana reform piece, the really pivotal thing that happened, I think happened in 95, 96. You had a group of local activists, Dennis Perone and others in California, who had drafted a ballot initiative, but had no ability to get it on the ballot. And so it was kind of a pipe dream. And
literally.
Yes, literally. And I was contacted by Ed Rosenthal, of all people. And Ed, asked me to jump in, grossly underestimating what it would take. Dennis initially said he didn't want any help, but then finally said, sure, we want help to help us go. And I was in this unusual position to know 4 very wealthy men: George Soros, Peter Lewis, the former head of Progressive Insurance, who died a couple years ago, John Sperling, who had just become very wealthy when creating University of Phoenix, and George Zimmer, the head of the Men's Warehouse. And none of those guys really knew one another. I think Soros and Lewis had met once or twice. And I was in this position to create a partnership of Soros, Lewis, and Zimmer with respect to Prop 215, the medical marijuana initiative, Sperling with respect to another initiative we did in Arizona, and create a partnership among these major donors to basically win Prop 215 and an Arizona initiative on treatment instead of incarceration. And then we got I was also in a position to get to know Lawrence Rockefeller, who kicked in money, and Richard Dennis, who'd been the first man, blah, 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 blah. And then I was able to go back in 97, the single most successful fundraising date of my life. I remember it was a day in the summer of 97 where in 24 hours, I persuaded George Soros, Peter Lewis, and John Sperling in 3 separate conversations to commit basically over $8 million total, so a third of it each, to support basically the medical marijuana initiatives and treatment instead of incarceration in 97, 98. So we won California in 96. Then my political consultant, Bill Zimmerman, and a few others, we looked, we scanned the country. Half the states had ballot initiatives possibilities. We identified Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine as the 6 states which had an initiative process where support for legalizing medical marijuana was high and where they weren't so big that we could afford to do them. And then I get the 3 big donors, the 3 billionaires, Soros, Lewis, and Sperling. We do this partnership. We also fight off an effort in Oregon to recriminalize marijuana. We fight off some stuff in Arizona. 1998, we win 9 ballot initiatives and referendum. DC also comes through then. Then I go back to these guys and I get them to double down again. And then we go into 2000. We had to win Nevada again. We had to win Colorado again. Then we did stuff on treatment instead of incarceration. We did stuff on asset forfeiture reform. And we basically broke things open. Right? And then when the Clinton administration threatened to go after doctors who were recommending medical marijuana. We sued their butts on First Amendment grounds together with the ACLU. We fought a 7-year battle. It was called Conan v. McCaffrey at the beginning and Conan v. Walters in the end. We beat their butts in federal court. Nicest contribution I ever got at DPA was a check for, I think, over $300,000 from the drug czar's office reimbursing us for our attorney's fees for beating their butts in federal court. So we won that battle, right? And then we just, then MPP, Peter Lewis started funding MPP and Rob Campia in the around 2002. So those guys started to play a significant role. We started divvying up states. DPA then, fast forward to New Mexico, 2007, 6-year campaign, the first state to set up through legislation a medical marijuana dispensary regulatory system. So that became the new second generation of this stuff. Then monumental battles in New Jersey and New York for us, in which we had to, in both cases, get shafted by the legislature, the governor, the final thing, but still legalized in those states. Had to do Maine again in 2009. The battle just on and on and on. And then with legalization, beginning first in 2010, with Richard Lee, the California initiative. It's one of the few cases where I would say we lost the initiative but won the bigger war. Because what Richard did was historical in terms of generating a new national and even inter-American dialogue. And then 2012, obviously massive, 2014, and blah, blah, blah.
And here we are.
Yeah.
That's pretty well done. By the way,
thank you.
We're gonna just go ahead and clip that and put that out there. That's easy enough. Thank you for everything that you've done. There's people like me who aren't having conversations like this with people like you without your work.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Look, it's a great pleasure. I look forward to this. As I say, what are we fighting for? That a generation from now, people will look back on the marijuana wars of the late 20th and early 21st century the same way that today we look back on alcohol prohibition and basically go, what the hell was that all about?
That's it. That's exactly it. And that's a good place to leave this part. I've got 3 final questions for you. They are all the same. The third one's new. I'll ask you all of them so you have a chance to kind of chew on them. What has most surprised you in cannabis? And I know for you that's only one piece, but what has most surprised you in cannabis? What has most surprised you in life? And I know that you have a daughter. And what has, if on your soundtrack of life there are songs, name at least one. So that's the third and last question, because people usually have the toughest time with that one. But what's most surprised you in cannabis?
I think if I had to pick just one, I don't think I foresaw the whole thing with marijuana, consumption of marijuana in non-smokable forms. The vaporization, the edibles, all of that stuff, the way that's happened so quickly, that was something that just I had not envisioned or imagined. And I think in terms of looking at this industry, obviously the speed with which the changes happened the last few years, both in terms of legalization, public opinion shifting, and the industry emerging, that's been a pleasant surprise. But the thing, I might have anticipated that, the whole edibles consumption change, that's the thing I did not see as much coming.
What's your take on that as far as policy is concerned?
Well, I think, look, it's almost like a new product is coming into American society, and we're learning how to regulate it better, and people need to learn, their dosing level. It took me a while, and I realized, with edible, give me 7 milligrams, for a kind of nice back, but I had to learn. And
start low and go slow.
Exactly. That part I knew, but the part about what my dose is and, if I want to, depends what you're doing, of course, right? So people have to learn their dose levels, and this is a powerful substance, fortunately not very dangerous, but still powerful and very disorienting. So,
indeed.
Yeah.
All right. So what has most surprised you in life? You've met some interesting folks along the way.
What most surprised me in life?
You've done a lot yourself.
I will say that, there was a part of me growing up with my dad as a leader and a rabbi, and growing up with a strong, I was always fascinated by, by the time I was 8, I wanted to be a history professor when I grew up, so sense of American history, Jewish history, all that sort of stuff. So I hoped for great things for myself. But doing what I'm doing today, and having built this organization and played a key role in building this movement, that exceeded anything that I think I could have dreamt for. when I was younger.
Because you could have just been standing in front of a class and kind of telling them what happened.
Yeah. I mean, I thought maybe I'd be a professor, I'd be this or that, but I didn't envision playing this. What I hope, I think it's fair to say it's already an historical role, and I hope it'll be viewed, in a significant way in that way. I mean, for me, the people, my heroes are people like, Mandela or Martin Luther King or Václav Havel. They're people who fought for freedom and against injustice, and obviously those guys were in much riskier places and sacrificed their freedom and their lives in a way that I have not had to do in any way. And my contributions will never compare in the slightest way to theirs. But those have been the sort of role models, the sort of more grandiose role models for me in life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those are good ones, to say the least. So let's end on a lighter note. Literally, if you've got this soundtrack of your life, what's at least one track?
Well, it's funny. The one that I think probably jumps to mind first for a few reasons is My Favorite Things by John Coltrane.
Oh.
And really, My Favorite Things is just, but I think also, I grew up playing the alto sax and occasionally the baritone sax. And so I felt a connection with Coltrane. And that album, My Favorite Things, which I was turned on to in my freshman year of college, really transformed my musical life. In terms of understand, I played alto sax in my high school jazz band, but I hadn't known jazz at that level. But then lastly, the way if people ask me what's the principal influence on my public speaking apart from my father, I would say it would be John Coltrane. Because the way when you listen to Coltrane, and My Favorite Things is a beautiful example of it, where you start off with a very simple melody, a simple theme, and then where he takes it into these wonderful places without ever losing sight of the theme and then brings it back in again. And, the basic message of drug policy reform is a fairly simple one. It really is. But the joy and the pleasure is not just in the beauty of and the essentialness of that core message, but it's in all the flights of fancy and the different permutations and the innovation where you take it in between. And so I think Coltrane's My Favorite Things is really... Thanks for asking me that question. I've never given that answer before. So
it is possibly the best answer that we'll ever hear. Ethan Nadelmann,
well,
thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Seth.
Ethan Nadelmann. I mean, that man has quite a mind, and he really did share with us not only his thinking, but what's gone into his mind, what's informed him from childhood through now in terms of drug policy. Very much appreciate Ethan Nadelmann's time.